This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good morning. My name is Suzanne Lynch and I'm co-author of Brussels Playbook, Politico's flagship morning newsletter, and you're watching Politico Live. I'm delighted to be joined with a stellar lineup of guests for this morning's Politico Live session at a crucial time for Europe and the world. With war raging in Ukraine and the European Council, G7 and NATO summits coming up, it could not be a more opportune time to delve into some of the issues that matter. But first things first, we have some housekeeping remarks. I would like to thank our partner, the Wilfrid Martin Centre for European Studies, for making this event possible. Thanks also to all of you joining us online. We'd like to make this event as interactive as possible. You can participate by tweeting @LivePolitico and ask questions via Slido using #EUDefence. And just a health warning that I will be prioritising questions which are sent with a name and organisation, just so all is transparent for you, our viewers, and our interviewees. You can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll, which is presented by the Wilfrid Martin Centre. How would you rate the European Union's response to the war in Ukraine? We'll take a look at the results at the end of our event. Before we get started, we'll now hear some opening remarks from the President of the Wilfrid Martin Centre for European Studies, Mikolas Zerinda.
Thank you, Suzanne. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to greet you all on behalf of the Wilfrid Martin Centre for European Studies. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to attend the joint event with Politico, focused on Ukraine and the future European defence policy in the context of the transatlantic security. All eyes of the entire democratic world are on Ukraine in these days. We try to provide Ukraine with all necessary assistance, humanitarian,
No, he's not yet in the studio.
material, financial, as well as a military one. We take care of people fleeing Ukraine, but at the same time, we try to gradually terminate our energy dependency on Russia, step up the sanctions against the Kremlin, and thinking about all other consequences of this war. The EU has been founded as a peace project, whose main aim was to secure peace and stability inside the EU. These days, we need to adopt common European decisions which will guarantee our European security and eliminate the threats from the outside. We have been facing unprecedented challenges in recent 15 years. The global financial and euro crisis, immigration influx, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now Russia's war against Ukraine. All these crises call for a change of the basic paradigm on which the EU has been created and developed. We need to transform the EU from a group of inward-looking, wealthy, but fragmented, cumbersome, and military weak nations into a more united, effectively acting, and stronger, resilient community, ready not only to develop, but also defend itself and other nations who share our values. I mean that we should proceed with the final step of the European integration, to the completion of the EU into a form of an authentic federation It means a political union built and developed on the consistent implementation of the principle of subsidiarity. If we want to build an effective European defense, we need to increase defense spending and, first of all, change our decision-making process in the area of foreign policy. We need to move on from seeking consensus to the effective decision-making to avoid a stalemate caused by a veto of a single EU member state. The European defense pillar must be built as and become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not as a competitor or duplicate of NATO. It would be beneficial for the whole transatlantic community if the EU can defend the eastern and southern flanks of the alliance. Europe must also be able to share global alliances with like-minded countries to defend our basic values and a rule-based international order. Dear friends, I wish us all a useful and inspiring discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Miklas, for joining us. Very interesting thoughts that we will come back to. I'd like to welcome now our panellists. Mircea Joana, Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Erik Kroos, Member of the Estonian Parliament. Jana Kusala, Director General, Defence Policy Department of the Ministry of Defence, Finland. And Stefano Sannino, Secretary General of the European External Action Service. You're all very welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for this discussion. Before we get back to some of those bigger themes that were raised there by Miklas, I'm just going to start with Finland, which is very much one of the countries at the moment. Obviously, we all know that Finland and Sweden have officially applied to join NATO. Turning to you, Mr. Kusala, how confident are you that Finland is, if you like, sufficiently aligned with NATO to make this transition as seamless as possible once the ratification by all NATO members happens?
Well, I'm very confident. I think we have been laying the basis for our accession to NATO already over many years. We have done very close cooperation with NATO as a partner country, and we have done very close cooperation with a number of NATO allies, and our interoperability and our ability to work with NATO is on a very good level. So in Finland, we are confident that it will be a smooth transition.
And I mean, are you concerned? We've obviously heard a lot of warnings from Turkey, from Ankara, that they may not accept these new applicants to the alliance. Can you give us some insight into what the thinking is in Helsinki about this? I mean, are you concerned? Are you reaching out to Ankara about the concerns they may have?
Well, of course, Turkey, as an allied nation, has every right to flag up their concerns when the alliance is about to take in new members. We have been in contact with Turkey from Finland all along during our membership process already early on this spring. And recently, when Turkey has raised issues concerning Finland and Sweden, we have continued to have contacts with Ankara. And we have tried to gain a better understanding of the issues that Turkey has raised. And I think these contacts will continue. It's hard to say how long this will take, but we will, of course, carefully listen to what Turkey has to say.
And of course, I mean, even if, you know, that Turkey decides, yes, they agree to that. As you said, you don't know how long this is going to take. I mean, are you concerned about that grey zone, that time between now and when you become fully fledged members of NATO? How are you preparing for that?
Well, I'm not concerned. We have a very robust, well-developed defense capability, and we have a very strong total defense system in our society, and the resilience is very high. So already for a number of years and decades, we have been fully prepared to defend our country. against whatever we may face. So we are as prepared as a nation can be, and it's also important for us to know that a number of NATO nations have very clearly stated that they support the Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO, and if we would end up in some kind of trouble that we couldn't handle on our own assets, we would get support. So we are prepared to take all the time there is needed. This is just one phase in our long path towards NATO membership.
Yeah, that idea that Finland, in fact, has been preparing for this, in one sense, there's some parts of the Finnish different governments, etc., have always wanted this, and obviously the public mood has changed and as behind this decision to join. So yes, it's not coming out of the blue, as it were. Maybe we'll go now to Tallinn. Mr. Cruz from the Estonian Parliament, you're very welcome and thanks for joining us. What's the feeling in Estonia and the Baltic nations about this? Really, we're on the cusp of change with NATO and these two Nordic countries about to join. You're very close geographically there. What's your view on the decision by Finland in particular to join the alliance?
Well, of course, while the overall security situation is very bad for Europe right now, the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO for the Baltic states it's very welcome news. So I would say that this is like the best thing that can happen for the Baltic security. So in that regard, we are pleased. Regarding the overall European situation, the question was, have we somewhat understood each other better now? Is Europe facing and responding to the crisis as it should and adequately? I would say in general, our feeling is that we have come over a big misunderstanding and are quite united in Europe regarding the threat assessment. We now for the first time have a common European threat assessment. All EU members share that view, and that is very good news. Where we haven't agreed entirely yet is how to deal with that threat. But I'm sure we will talk about that.
Yeah, we might come back to that one. I mean, you're saying there, I suppose, that this this invasion by Russia has, I suppose, galvanized NATO and kind of maybe given it a bit more purpose. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Well, I'm not entirely sure it has galvanized NATO enough, but yes, on NATO's eastern flank, the threat assessment, the threat picture hasn't actually changed. For us, the Russian threat has been real for years. And we have been trying to convince, sometimes maybe not politely enough, our Western partners that, guys, this is a problem. Well, now this question is off the table. Everybody understands and agrees that this is a problem. So now we are in deep conversations about how to deal with that. And that we'll talk about the Madrid summit, how much more defense would the eastern flank need, how to deal with this actual war scenario. And those discussions are, of course, very, very welcome.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, how to actually deal with this now. Does your country and other Baltic nations, but you're speaking for Estonia as a member of parliament, support the introduction of a more permanent presence of NATO troops in your country?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, the situation regarding the defense of the Baltic states particularly, that regards somewhat also other eastern flank countries, but in some ways the Baltic situation is particular. We have since 2014 the so-called enhanced forward presence of NATO, which means there is a NATO battalion battle group in each Baltic country. The numbers were doubled now since February, which is good news. But this is the so-called tripwire situation. Those units are here to conceive an attack, then nobody in their right mind can envision that the NATO battalion plus our forces can actually hold the territory for a very long time. So inevitably, the plan is that the territory will be lost, and then maybe, hopefully, it will be taken back by NATO. Now, this is the only territory of NATO where this plan is actually right now in place. So our question is, if you look at Ukraine, then we all can see what this taking back territory actually looks like. So if we have declared, NATO has declared that every inch of NATO territory will be protected. So fine, but let's then plan for it for real. We need much more permanent presence here. We need more capabilities. Of course, we are contributing ourselves as much as we can. Estonia has added 1 billion euros, which is, for us is a big number for the next few years for procurement and defense expenditures. But there are capability holes that we need to fill.
So what in particular, I mean, what would be enough? What are you looking for from NATO in terms of numbers?
Capabilities-wise, our main concern is air defense. We are lacking that. Yes, we have the air policing. We have the NATO fighter jets policing the airspace of the Baltic states. But our air defense capabilities are very weak. Of course, we are planning our own procurements, but any help there would be very important. And of course, here Finland and Sweden eventually will come to play, and the whole defense planning will look very different once Finland and Sweden have joined, and that would look much better. But we're talking about the real situation now. Yeah. So air defense, and we need a plan of which units actually will participate in the defense of the Baltic states in case of a war scenario. We have rotating units that come in, come out. It's very good as deterrence, hopefully, but they do not really have a predetermined role in the defense plan. So we need an agreed plan, and we need to know that those units will do this and that from those countries once we need them. And for that, we do not need a division present in each Baltic country, but we need a command structure. We need to have command elements pre-agreed. We need air defense, and we need some coastal defense, etc. But those are all details that can be agreed about, I hope.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chiana, turning to yourself and NATO, I mean, first of all, the bigger question there, has the Russia invasion of Ukraine galvanised NATO, or, as Mr. Cross says, maybe not enough? It hasn't done enough to galvanise NATO. What's your view on that?
I think the brutal war that Russia has waged against the independent and innocent Ukraine has galvanized not only NATO, not only the EU, but something which is much deeper and much more important. It galvanized our democratic societies. Look at the support we give to Ukraine. Of course, governments in NATO, EU, significant help, sanctions, that's the political level. But I'm seeing in every train station in Europe, in every airport across Europe and North America, young citizens of those countries fundraising for Ukraine. So our civil society, our youth has galvanized. Speaking of our help to Ukraine, we give lots of cyber support to Ukraine. NATO has been training the armed forces of Ukraine since 2014, since the illegal annexation of Crimea. But without the help of private sector, cyber defenses of Ukraine would have been much weaker. Look at the cyber attack that Russia has conducted against the satellite that was providing internet for Ukraine. There was another private company that came in and filled in this thing. So yeah, galvanization at the political level indeed, but something which is far more important, the holy triangle between political level, private sector, and our citizens have been galvanized. And if we can do this, then we can and maintain this beyond this war. It means that our democratic resilience will be stronger, and then we can compete with anyone in very good conditions.
Interesting. I mean, what's your view on the imminent arrival of Finland and Sweden into the alliance? I mean, how is that going to shape NATO, and how significant is it, and in what way?
These two countries are the closest partners to NATO already. We've been working with them, exercising together with them, and the level of intimacy is very, very profound already. We salute the decision of the two countries to join. They are superb democracies, they are high-end militaries, and they will contribute significantly not only to the Baltic region security, but I think to the overall of our alliance. Of course, in an organization like ours, concerns of all allies should be taken into account. There is an active dialogue taking place between Turkey, Finland, and Sweden. Secretary General Stoltenberg offered his good offices, and we are now working to have, we hope, quite soon, the three parties also coming here in NATO HQ, and we are confident that these two countries will join our ranks.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. Moving on to Mr. Sannino on the EU side of things, where we're finally getting there. My first question was going to be, and I see somebody has already put this question in, it's an obvious one. Andre Angus, do you think that the European strategic autonomy, as he says, initially advocated by France, still makes sense? But the idea of the strategic compass, I mean, this whole new idea for European defence obviously was conceived before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but how has it changed it, and is it still relevant now?
Well, I think that it's, I would say it's even more relevant in the sense that the security and defense dimension has become even more important under the present circumstances. It is true, and Eric was mentioned this, that we have now developed a common threat assessment of the, let's say, the challenges that we have around us, and that's a very important point because this means that we have a common ground in which we can work in terms of evaluation of what needs to be done. Now we have to give ourselves the instruments that are necessary in order to face these threats and these challenges. I think that it's I would say, the debate about EU and NATO, for me, it's a little bit theological. I've never believed too much in the fact that the two organizations are competing. We are completely different in nature. We are completely different in the way we operate, in our objectives. It is evident that NATO has a key role to play in terms of security for the and defense for the continent. But it is also true that the European Union can contribute in many ways to its own security and to the security in the context of NATO. And that's what the instruments that we are developing are meant for.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that, this EU-NATO declaration, this idea of reviving or re-examining those more formal links. Maybe you could update us on where that stands, what should we expect? Are there going to be any changes now to this interaction between the EU and NATO because, I suppose, of what's happened over the last few months?
I think that if I can change one word of what you said is formal. The point is not about the formal links between you and NATO, but the pragmatic and concrete work that we are doing together. We all know which are the problems and the difficulties that we have within the two institutions, organizations, but this does not mean that on the ground and in concrete terms we can and we work together in a very constructive way. So for me, the question is not that much about declarations. The question is much more about the complementarity of the action that we are performing on the ground. Mircea was speaking, for example, about hybrid. It's certainly a sector where we can and we are working together. And there are many other areas where the European Union can contribute significantly with its assets and capabilities in a situation where you have to have conventional security capacity, but also capacity to react to this hybrid mechanism and hybrid attacks that we are facing. So, again, for me, the problem is not much about the form, it's about the substance.
Yeah, interesting there about that role that in hybrid in particular that the EU could offer. Getting back as well, staying with you, Stefano, from Michela's point at the very beginning, from the Wilfred Martin Centre, gave a very passionate call for greater EU cooperation and a cohesive, if you like, sense of defence policy. Do you think this has changed the calculation for the EU in terms of defence policy?
Indeed, I think that if we look at the development of the security and defense dimension of the European Union along these last few years, it's been really quite remarkable, because we have given ourselves, once again, structures which are relevant, coming from and starting from the creation of the European Defence Agency to the definition of European military staff, military committee. So somehow we have gained a lot of strength from that point of view. We have 18 operations on the ground between military and civilian, also some with executive powers. So, there was already a basis, but it is true that the Russian aggression to Ukraine has been a sort of a turning point in the willingness and determination to move forward. And the mobilization of the European Peace Facility, now we have 2 billion already mobilized, to support the supply of armaments to Ukraine, is a very bold, I would say, watershed decision which has been taken by the European Union that has turned us into an actor from that point of view. And once again, the complementarity between the EU and NATO, including in the war in Ukraine, has been extremely relevant, because we have been able to work as a team, and we have managed to have an impact on the capacity of Ukrainians to resist the aggression.
Yeah, as you mentioned there, the European Peace Facility, now 2 billion. First time the EU has sent lethal weapons to a third country, so obviously extremely significant. And yet, as Michela's made the point at the very beginning, and other unnamed countries have made the point, the system, the lack of, the unanimity issue is maybe holding, is a brake to further EU defence cooperation.
Is it a brake to NATO?
Well, yeah, but you're here with your EU hat on. Do you think we need a more fundamental look at how the treaties work and how the EU is able to move forward with defence?
Look, for my history and personal conviction, I'm very much in favor of a much further integration. But the point is what can be achieved under the present circumstances and the progress in this process. So, certainly qualified majority voting in foreign policy would facilitate and would speed up a number of things. But things are what they are. The system is what it is. That's the mechanism in which we are working. There are 27 member states, 27 sovereign countries around the table, and we need to take into account this element. But as I was saying, this is true not only for, I was joking, but up to a point. Yeah. This is true also in NATO, and this does not mean that NATO is not capable of taking decisions. And when there are problems and when there are difficulties, you discuss it. We have discussed, for example, how to move ahead with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, the problem with one ally. That's part of our life, that's part of our work.
Yeah. Just getting back to Helsinki, Mr. Kusala, what's Finland's view on the need for further EU defence? Do you think the EU has done its job when it's come to how to respond to this unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Yes, absolutely. We think that the EU has done its job and done it well in good cooperation with NATO. So we have seen a very good level of European unity here. And we are very satisfied with the direction where EU's defense policy is heading towards, and EU's role as a security and defense actor. And we think that the recently published strategic compass lays out and focuses on all the right questions and issues where EU really has a role to play and can make a real value added.
Great, thank you. Just returning to you, Mr. Joanna, on this issue of NATO's next steps now. What about the question, we've heard it there from Estonia, that the Baltic nations are calling for more of a NATO presence in their countries. What's your view on that? Do you think the alliance is prepared to consider more specific help, and what that help might be for the Baltic members?
We are now 20 days away from the NATO summit in Madrid. And of course, we are always tempted to say that our summits are historic. But this one will really be transformative. We'll be taking decisions. Our leaders will take decisions on a more robust presence on the eastern flank. And I have full confidence that the discussions underway inside NATO will lead to a very significant change in our presence on the eastern flank, all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And just to make a small comment, for the first time ever, all the defense plans for all the eastern flank countries, including for Turkey, have been activated after the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Then we'll adopt a new strategic concept for NATO. Of course, together with Stefano and his team and the EU, he came here in NATO to brief us on the strategic compass of the EU, and we salute that very important document. But also, the strategic concept of NATO is the second most important document after the Washington Treaty in everything we do. So that the negotiations we have and the adoption by our leaders of the new strategic concept will carve the way forward for the next decade for the transformation of NATO, not only in terms of collective defense, but also to adapt and adjust to a much broader definition of security, cyber, space, new technologies, hybrid, climate change and security. And this is the obligation of NATO to be permanently adjusting to a changed environment. Also because we are entering, as we speak, in the era of great power competition. For the first time ever in Madrid, we'll have at the highest level our 4 Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, attending our summit. Also because the world is changing and NATO needs to adjust to this changing world. Of course, the enlargement of NATO, open doors, will be an important topic. We do hope that we'll have Sweden and Finland joining our ranks. And of course, we have to take decisions on Ukraine. We'll have President Zelensky attending one or another our summit in Madrid. So I'm just saying that this in 20 days from now, a myriad of issues will be addressed by our leaders. And I can say with conviction and confidence that this will be indeed one of the most transformative summits in NATO's history. And we're looking forward to another very, very important decade for us. NATO is the central piece of European security. We are the indispensable link between North America and Europe. And we salute the fact that the European Union is playing an ever greater role as our natural strategic partner. And as Stefano has said, between NATO and EU, we are working closer and closer together. We have decided, and it's up to our leaders to sanction this formally, but in practice we decided to work closer on resilience, on new technologies, on space, on climate change and security. So I would say that NATO and EU, we are indispensable strategic partners to each other, and we complement each other, and we bring synergies together. And this is why I'm so confident that the summit in Madrid will be a massive success for all of us.
Interesting, and thanks for that overview of what to expect in a few weeks in Madrid. You mentioned about there would be a more robust presence of NATO in the Baltics. I mean, specifically, should we expect something on the whole air defence side of things, or, troops, a more permanent presence?
On everything. Because when we speak about deterrence and defense in the new logic, Russia will continue to be an aggressive and unpredictable player in European and global affairs. So what we are doing now, we are looking of course, to the land component that our Estonian colleague mentioned. I salute the decision announced by Chancellor Scholz in Vilnius just the other day that Germany will be beefing up its presence, already significant, up to a brigade level. In my home country of Romania, France has taken the lead of a Bell Group, and there will be more presence. Italy is leading the new one in Bulgaria. We will be seeing the Czech Republic leading the new Bell Group in Slovakia. And of course, in the Baltic countries and in Poland, we'll have more presence. So numbers matter, of course, but we are looking at land, we are looking at air, we are looking at sea, we are looking at space, and we are looking at cyberspace. We are looking to prepositioning equipment. We are looking to command and control. We are looking to logistics. We are looking to fuel and supply chains. So we are doing a fundamental change in the way in which we will be basically defending and deterring our eastern flank countries. And the addition of Sweden and Finland will add to the eastern flank and to the coherence of the whole eastern flank from Norway all the way down to Turkey. And this is a very important transformation that we are working as we speak. There is negotiations. But we are confident that in Madrid, our leaders will take robust and historic decisions also on our posture on the eastern flank.
Thanks. And just before I get to some of the questions that are coming in, and please do enter any questions for those of you watching online. I mean, are you worried that this transformative, as they call it, NATO summit that's going to happen in a couple of weeks, that's going to antagonise Russia? Are you concerned about that?
Listen, we've been trying since the fall of the Berlin Wall to engage with Russia constructively. They continue to believe something that is total nonsense and an utter lie, that in a way the West, the Americans and Western countries, members of NATO, have been in a way coercing nations like mine or Estonia or Slovakia or the newcomers into NATO in the last 25 years. And this is absolutely the opposite of this. Look at this huge success of open door policy. Look at the way in our GDPs, our societies, and our self-confidence have boosted into this. So in 1997, just a small piece of recent history, we also signed, together with Russia, a NATO-Russia Founding Act. On both sides, we decided two correlative things to do. For Russia, they took, like they took under the UN Charter, under the OSCE, Helsinki Final Act, and many international obligations that they are part of, Russia. They took the obligation not to threaten or use force against any country in Europe, that they will not be going against territorial integrity of countries in Europe, and in exchange for that, because Russia would have been a normal country, important of course, but not aggressive anymore, after the end of the Cold War, that will have basically no permanent presence on the newcomers on the eastern flank. We did that. The moment we started that tripwire presence was after 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea and a portion of the Donbass. Today, Russia basically walked out from the founding act with us. So as long as they stay unpredictable and aggressive, we'll have to take our measures. Of course, we hope that one day Russia would change course. This is a dead end for Russia. This is one of the most strategic, important historic failures for Russia, believing that Ukraine will be basically welcoming Russia as liberators, and look at the fierce resistance. Believing that the West will be disunited and weak. Look at the level of unity and strength and resolve we are showing. So for us, constructive relations with Russia will always be important as long as Russia behaves as a normal country and really abides by the international norms that she's still a member of. Could anyone have imagined ever that a permanent member of the Security Council would basically ignore in such a blatant way the fundamental principles of the UN Charter of territorial integrity and sovereign rights of nations to defend themselves? So yeah, that's a tough one, but we do the job we are doing. We are in the business of protecting 1 billion people from 30, we hope 32 nations pretty soon. And this is something we take very seriously. We don't want confrontation with Russia. We are very cautious here in NATO not to escalate the war in Ukraine into something bigger between NATO and Russia. But the ball is in Russia's court. If they want to come back and become a constructive and normal player, abiding by the international norms, we'll be open for re-engaging with them. For the time being, they prove just to be the opposite of that.
Thank you. Okay, just a few questions I'm coming to here. This is a question from David Russell. Henry Kissinger advised Ukraine to cede part of its territory to end the conflict and to keep Russia in the Western-oriented sphere. How does the war end? Who wants to come in on that? Maybe Mr. Kroos in Estonia. What do you think about that suggestion about how, that should some territory be ceded? How does this conflict end?
Well, Mr. Kissinger, of course, is old and experienced, so he should remember that this was already tried in 1938 in Munich. Let's give some territory, some Czech territory at that time, to Hitler, and then that would avoid the next aggression. So that's how it would go. Also, this proposal is totally contradicting all basic norms of international law, and it would only provoke Russia to ask for more. That's the basic concept of deterrence. If you want to deter a threat, you do not deter it with a less threat. You deter it with a bigger threat, a bigger force. So that's how you face Russia. That also regards the more presence of NATO forces or capabilities on the eastern flank. It's if NATO would respond to this war with giving less forces to the eastern flank because more forces might provoke Russia, then it's exactly the other way around. Less forces would indicate Russia that, okay, those guys are a little afraid. That would provoke. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose Ukraine would say, when you're talking about deterrence, very, very interesting points there, that they begged in January, February. I was there at the Munich Security Conference when Zelensky, a few days before war, begged the West, Europe, to do more and to impose sanctions, saying, that's the whole point of deterrence. There's no point doing it after they invaded. And, looking at what happened, they had a very good point there, that really this, deterrence West didn't do enough. But, I take your point there as an interesting one about how far NATO and the West needs to go to warn Russia rather than, as you would put it, not putting words in your mouth, appease. Another question along similar lines, Andre Enges, how would you comment on President Macron's comment that Russia should not be humiliated? Finland. Mr. Kusela, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think he has a point?
As government civil staffer, I shouldn't comment other governments, heads of states comments. But I will say this, that I think where Russia stands now is completely because of their own choices, their own actions, and their own willingness to take huge risks and to wage a very brutal, aggressive war in Europe. And I think if Russia at some point feels humiliated or feels failed, they really need to look at the mirror. They themselves have caused that.
Yeah. Mr. Kroos, do you want to come back in on that? I mean, what's your view on that we shouldn't humiliate Russia?
Well, I think Mr. Macron has the historical context a little bit off here. And I would think he's referring to 1919 and humiliating Germany with the Versailles treaties and then see what happened next. If you think about it, Germany was so-called humiliated much more with World War II than they were with World War I, because after World War I, the German people were not even told that Germany lost the war. They thought that they actually won, right? So what is missing in Mr. Macron's rhetoric is that he actually is also saying that Ukraine needs to be supported and Ukraine needs to at least win or be successful in the war, and then that we need to talk and communicate with Russia, relate with Russia after the war. We need to be able to do that. But the big question is what's going to be in the interim period. And frankly, our view, the sort of Russian neighbors' view since World War II has been that as long as Russia doesn't deal with its aggressive past, Stalinist crimes, this mentality of imperialist chauvinism that is still there. So it's a question of internal Russian thinking about its own role in the world. I mean, they have to deal with themselves. Yeah. So I would say that our policy to Russia would be, like with a teenager who has done something wrong. Put it in your room, no phone, no communication, you're grounded, and you clean up your room, and then you come out after it's done.
Thanks. I mean, I think it is important to say that this is shaping up to be one of the big debates over the next few months. And I think there are divisions here within Europe about how to handle this inevitable, when it will come, peace talks. Although obviously there's a lot of speculation that this could really settle into some kind of frozen conflict. But how to treat Russia and how to stand up to Russia, or anyway, Ukraine will be obviously the key player there, as will Russia. A question for Mr. Joanna. This is from Josef Nishnik. How does NATO react to the Russian nuclear threat?
These are irresponsible declarations. Russia and Soviet Union before, they are a major nuclear superpower. And with that kind of position comes also responsibility, not only strength. So we condemn this irresponsible use and abuse of such rhetoric. Having said that, we are not seeing, in terms of the military dimension of this discussion, any change in practical terms from a military and posture stand view. And also, if you looked at NATO, which is a nuclear alliance, we have not taken and risen our level of alertness on nuclear at all. So there is a big discrepancy between the rhetoric, which we condemn, and the reality, which seems to be relatively at normal levels. But in itself, that's a very bad signal. This is not only a signal towards us in NATO, it's a signal to the rest of the world. And if a member of the Security Council and a major nuclear superpower behaves like that in terms of invading a neighbor and saber-rattling with nuclear rhetoric, that's not a very encouraging sign for a world where a system of norms and predictability in strategic affairs should be the norm and not the exception.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Sannino now, back to what we were discussing earlier about EU defence policy. This is from Joshua. Is there space for neutrality, for example, Ireland, Austria, in the EU, who are neutral countries, as EU defence integration continues?
Indeed, there is certainly that there is space. First of all, the concept is a concept of security and defense that we are developing. So it's not only the military dimension, but it's also the security dimension that is in question. And then, as I was saying, we are certainly developing also a military component, and it is important. And I was mentioning the mission that we have on the ground, and the things that we want to do in the strategic compass. We are identifying the possibility of developing capabilities in order to intervene in specific theaters, in specific situations. But there is much more broadly an element of contribution that all member states, including the neutral ones, can give to the security when it comes to definition of other policies, other areas, which, for example, was mentioning space, or was mentioning climate change and security, or the hybrid. Disinformation is also another area which is taking a lot of relevance in this context. And it is interesting to note that also the countries that are neutral have contributed, for example, with the non-lethal components to the support to Ukraine in the context of the European Peace Facility. So the answer is definitely yes.
Thank you. Lots of other questions coming in. I'm just going to read some of them, but we've already covered them. Philippe Lefebvre, how do you see the upcoming EU-NATO declaration changing both organisations' capabilities? I think we've covered that one. Another question, what is the risk of Russia using nuclear weapons? We've spoken about that. Going back to you, Mr. Joanna, a question here from Alor Oljam. Is it not high time to declare the NATO-Russia Founding Act null and void?
No, Russia basically walked out from this document with us. It's basically emptied by Russia's actions. So we see no political and practical meaning in basically from our side declaring this document dead, because Russia, by its actions and its war, basically emptied. This document is void because of the actions of Russia. So we have no obligation, let me put it very clearly, for us to not put everything we consider appropriate for the deterrence and defense of the eastern flank. And this is just the opposite of everything that Mr. Putin tried to achieve. He wanted to have Ukraine in its spheres of influence. Now they have Ukraine moving bravely and heroically towards the West. They wanted to go back to the pre-1997 situation when it comes to NATO, and we have now more NATO on the eastern flank. He said that we should stop with NATO enlargement, look at Sweden and Finland, two neutral countries joining our ranks. So I would say it's just amazing how much the very opposite of the original intentions of Mr. Putin he has managed to achieve through his aggressive actions against Ukraine.
Thank you. We're coming towards the close. I have another question here. Again, it's for you, Mr. Joanna, an interesting one which I wanted to get into earlier. This is from Hiroshi Taro. What is the implication of the Ukraine war on NATO's Indo-Pacific strategy? How does NATO perceive the Taiwan issue, which could potentially be attacked by China?
I mentioned earlier that we are now in the era of great power competition, and of course Russia is the immediate and actual threat to our security, but also the rise of China is one of the most important transformations of world affairs. We don't see China as our adversary. We work very closely with our 4 Asia-Pacific partners. I mentioned the fact that the leaders, for the first time ever, will be joining our leaders in Madrid at the summit. And we have, a very robust engagement with our Asia-Pacific partners. I just received yesterday the special envoy of the new president of the Republic of Korea. They're very concerned about North Korea and the ballistic and nuclear actions that they are taking. So again, NATO is and will remain a regional organization. We are Euro-Atlantic, a transatlantic organization, but with global outreach, because evolutions in space, in cyberspace, the rise of China can also influence the security of our organization. So the answer is we'll have even more robust engagement with our Asia-Pacific partners, and looking forward to engaging with them in Madrid and after Madrid.
Yeah, so something to watch out for Madrid. Just on that topic, finally, getting back to yourself, Mr. Sannino, when we're talking about EU defence policy, obviously one of the big issues last year was the AUKUS deal, and France was obviously extremely annoyed at the way that played out. Again, this is all pre-Russian invasion, seems like a long time ago. But did that really kind of expose Europe and the EU's defence capability for really not being at the table when it comes to kind of serious defence policy and strategy in that part of the world?
Well, certainly, the military dimension is very relevant, but it's not the only one. We have now developed an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a very let's say, thorough and all-encompassing strategy, which is looking at the economic, trade, environment, digital, and many other dimensions, but it includes also a security dimension. This is the first one, the first time that in a regional strategy we are taking care also of the security dimension, and we are thinking about actions that can be taken in this area, also in the Indo-Pacific region. So I would say that we are catching up. We are moving in that direction. As I was saying before, the defense and security dimension of the European Union is relatively young, as is young the External Action Service. But if I see the progression, I think that there is a lot of potential to develop this work. Just mentioned the maritime presence, the fact that we are coordinating our maritime presence in the region. We have done it in the Gulf of Guinea, but we want to do it also in the Indian Ocean. And this is an element which is contributing to the security in the region. Everybody is contributing to with the instrument that it has at our disposal, and with the what is able to do best from that point of view. That's why the issue of complementarity with the other institutions is very relevant.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much. We're going to wrap things up now, and I'd like to really extend a thanks to our panellists for a fascinating discussion on NATO, on the EU. In particular, I think it's really given us some food for thought about what's coming up towards the last week of June, when we have the EU Council, the G7, and I suppose NATO, which is really going to be, as Mr. Giovanni said, really a huge moment for NATO and a transformative moment. Before we let you go, we're just going to have a quick look at the results of our poll. As you remember, we asked the question, how would you rate the European Union's response to the war in Ukraine? Some of the results in from the question posed by the Wilfred Martin Centre, the answer is 60% of people responded somewhat effective, somewhat ineffective, 26%, and the two extremes less so. So very effective, 7%, and very ineffective, 7% too. So thank you very much for participating in that. Thanks again to our speakers for joining us, to you, the audience, for tuning in online, and finally to our partner, the Wilfred Martin Centre for European Studies, for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so feel free to email us about the event at live@politico.eu. And you can check our Politico events website for the latest lineup on all our events happening this year. So all the best. Thank you for joining us. And until the next time, bye for now.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.